The cold cases you see at the Vault have captivated readers across our region for years. At the Vault podcast, our team of professional reporters takes you further into those stories with new interviews from family members, investigators, and experts. Check out The Vault at inforum.com/The Vault and subscribe to The Vault wherever you find your podcasts.
Welcome to Plain Talk, where we have a special treat for you today. We're going to have, I think actually the first general election debate in North Dakota. I think, is there been another one? I don't think there's been another one. So if there has been one, I apologize. I wasn't aware of it. And usually I don't miss these things. But it's the first debate. It's going to be the United States Senate debate between incumbent Republican Kevin Cramer and Democratic challenger Katrina Christiansen. Thank you both for your time coming on. We're going to be going for an hour. And as I just explained to the candidates before we started recording, our intent with these debates, and if you listened to the podcast last cycle, we did some of these as well. Our intent is to have a conversation. We didn't want to bog it down with a bunch of rules. You only get 2 minutes, and I'm sitting here with a stopwatch. Our intent is let's just be reasonable. We're going to ask questions. We expect answers. Please don't filibuster. Please don't talk over one another. We're going to do our best to cover a lot of ground while also giving you both time to talk and respond to one another. That's our intent. And we just want to have a good conversation so that the public can listen to the two candidates and decide how they feel about how these candidates respond to the issues. So we're going to get started. And first question, I think is an important one. We live in very, very divided political times. It seems like so much of our politics is organized around the other side, not just maybe being wrong about the policies or having a different philosophy, but being just wrong as people or even evil. So, Senator Cramer, first of all, talk a little bit about that. You've been in office for a while, first in the Senate, then previously in the House of Representatives. How do you navigate that? How do you navigate this environment that is so polarized, where there are certain political necessities to that, but on the other hand, you also have a job to do in terms of making policy and governing this country?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I mean, this is a great place to start, actually, in a political debate, because you're right. There's a place for it, and political debates is one of those places, right, where you have to differentiate between you and your opponent, and that can be done respectfully, without vitriol. But then there's the political side of things, where you're speaking to your base. Some days you're speaking to a broader audience. Other days, one of the things I've worked really hard at in the Senate is our relationships, personal relationships. Just about everything that I've introduced, I get a Democratic co-sponsor for. And one of the things I'm the most that I think feel the most honor about is just the most recent Congress, the 217th Congress. The votes aren't all in yet on the 18th, but where I was able to have a slightly more conservative voting record with the defender of limited government matrix, which is really done by sort of the CPAC group. So I have a slightly more conservative record than, say, Rick Scott. I think it was an 83% conservative record. But that same Congress, I received the Bipartisan Policy Council's Legislative Action Award, and it only goes to one Republican and then one Democrat, and the Democrat was Catherine Cortez Masto, because two of us actually work on a lot of things together. And I think what you're getting at, Rob, and I think what's important is it's the tone you set. It's not just how you vote or just how you legislate, but it's the tone you set. I think one of the greatest disappointments for me in the Congress is that so many people in Congress use all of their political capital every day, which means they don't store any up, which means they don't do a lot of favors for other people. They're not very transactional. They get on, primetime Fox News a lot, but they don't pass legislation. And when we passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, that was a good example, I think, of that. And there are several others. It's just that a little bit of this is on the media because they highlight the divisions more than they do the accomplishments.
Katrina, same question to you.
I think that's a really great question to start things off. I really just want to say that I appreciate you all taking the time to engage in this. I've gotten emails actually about people who say they were looking forward to hearing about this debate. So it's pretty exciting to be here. I've been campaigning for 10 months and I've tried to grow a lot as a candidate. And that means listening to people where they are. And one of the things that I've really come to realize is just how truly polarized we've become. And I don't see that helping us in terms of solving problems, in terms of achieving the things that we want to achieve as a state and as a nation in our communities. And respectfully, right, I want to make sure that when I'm in the United States Senate, I'm representing independents, I'm representing Republicans and Democrats, and representing North Dakota values. And that means listening to people where they are. And I'll tell you what, I mean, I have learned a lot, and I am so hopeful for the future in terms of pursuing a more centrist approach to governance, like we had in the 90s when I was learning about government. I look back at the last 24 years of Congress, and you've really got to scratch your head and wonder what happened to our ability to reach across the aisle and accomplish things. And there was a really great opportunity early on this year to solve something at the border, solve that border crisis with a bipartisan border bill. And I would have signed that. I think we need to have secure borders. And I hear about that on the trail from every type of North Dakotan. 1 out of 3 people that I talk to talks about the border. And so we need somebody in the U.S. Senate who's willing to do that work and be bipartisan, truly.
She did reference, before we jump into another question, she did reference a border bill, a bipartisan border bill. You ultimately voted against that bill, Senator Cramer. Why don't you talk about that and address that specifically?
Sure. First of all, I was very open to it for a very long time. As you probably know, I took a lot of heat, particularly from right-wing media. I mean, I always said I'd never go on Laura Ingraham, and yet I eventually did because she was so mean-spirited about it to explain why I was still open to it. But when the text finally came out, there was one thing in there that's just impossible for me to get over, and that is that they increased money specifically for sanctuary cities. And the very idea that we would reward cities for rolling out the welcome mat for violent criminals and become a sanctuary. Just think of that, a sanctuary for criminals. First of all, it'd be a violation of what I ran on and won on. I just couldn't go there. There were a lot of good things in that bill, and I still think it's a good jumping off point for the next Congress, to Katrina's point, going forward. And the border and immigration policy is one of the areas where the paralysis is so rich, because you have people on one side that they don't want dreamers, for example, to ever have citizenship. I personally think we ought to have a path for legal status for dreamers. But then on the left, they don't want, they don't want a merit-based immigration system, or they don't want a wall at the border. There is a lot that a lot of people want, probably something that everybody wants in a bill. But when you do that comprehensively, it gets a little bit challenging. So I agree. I think that is the low-hanging fruit going forward. But you just have to be willing to negotiate transactions. And today there's not a lot of appetite for transactions, and that's unfortunate, because the founders gave us a transactional Congress on purpose.
Before we move, I swear I'm going to let Chad ask a question here. But Katrina, you said you would vote for the bill. Kevin just described why he wouldn't have. Tell us why you would have.
Well, I actually think that I'd like to ask Senator Cramer why one of the most conservative members of the Senate, Senator Langford, who was the main negotiator for the GOP, why he couldn't go to him and say, this is a real concern for me. Is there a way that we could back this out? Because I think what I hear from voters all across the state, like I've already said, are really worried about this migratory crisis at our southern and northern border. They are worried about fentanyl coming into our communities. They are worried about human trafficking and child smuggling. And I think it's really important to remember, sometimes the more important thing is not where we start, but where we finish things. And this was a really good place to get resources into the Border Patrol. They would have had more money to install those fentanyl detectors. They would have had more money to bring on more Border Patrol agents to deal with those really challenging issues. And we haven't had comprehensive immigration reform in over 40 years. And so I just don't really see that there is an excuse to not go to the most conservative member and ask, hey, let's take care of this because we need to get these other things done. That's what I would have done.
I assure you that the problem with funding sanctuaries for criminals was not the conservative member's idea. That's what he had to accept from the liberals, who would never have voted for the bill if it wasn't in there. And therein lies the challenge of comprehensive. I've always liked to do things comprehensive. I've learned that doing things incrementally actually has more success when you can find, because you can always start with the common ground as opposed to the compromise ground. And so I agree with that. But I will say this. We didn't have these big fentanyl problems or 10,000 people crossing illegally with the previous president, and the laws were exactly the same. There hasn't been a will by the Democrats in Congress or in the White House to deal with this problem until it became a major, electoral problem for the current president. And then all of a sudden, therefore, this bill. The other problem with the bill really is more the process. Just so you know, James Lankford is my best friend in the Senate. His office is next to mine. His bedroom is next to mine. We live in the same house and share the same bathroom. So I know James really, really well. Pray with him at prayer breakfasts and Bible studies and all kinds of. We're just very close. So the problem wasn't James Lankford. It was the comprehensive part of the bill that just had some things that made it difficult for a lot of people to vote for it in the end. Particularly when all of the problems we're talking about were solved by the previous president, were allowed to happen under the current president. We need a change in leadership, and we can fix this without legislation. Then we should be working on some serious comprehensive immigration policy, particularly as it relates to workers.
Katrina, do you want the last word on immigration before we change subjects?
I think it's so important that we put aside little things to achieve big things. And like I said before, I want to be a centrist when it comes to governance. And so I think it's really important that we look at the current state of affairs, which is that fentanyl is a huge issue. It is such a dangerous thing right now. People don't know what fentanyl can end up in. And so it's incredibly important that our representatives give the Border Patrol the resources to install fentanyl detectors. And if that means pulling everything else out of the bill to get that across the president's desk, then that's what should happen to save the people in our communities from this really dangerous drug.
I think we could probably talk about immigration for the full hour. So I'm going to just shift us slightly to another easy topic, and that's Social Security. Recently, in May,
I think he's been easy facetiously.
Let's go on.
No one's that was
easy, Chad. Come on.
The Social Security Board of Trustees came out in May and said that we're looking at benefit cuts in 2035 if something significantly isn't done to fix Social Security. Currently, Americans pay Social Security taxes on the first $168,000 that they earn. So my question for you, sort of two-part, would you, one, support increasing the amount of income that's taxed for Social Security? And in addition, what other things would you do to make sure that Social Security stays solvent until, frankly, my kid is earning it, probably 50 years from now? Katrina, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So one of the things that I think is really exciting about living in the United States of America is that we actually have the greatest economy in the world. We have the most innovation, and we just continue to build on that innovation. And so I see an opportunity for our continued GDP growth to be something that helps us robustly deal with the Social Security cliff. But I do think it's appropriate for us to increase the income that we put in bracket for Social Security tax. I think that isn't there a joke kind of about billionaires that are done paying into Social Security like on New Year's Day or something like that. So I think it's really important that we talk about how to do that in a fair manner. But I think it's important that we look at not just taxing solutions, but growth solutions.
Senator Cramer?
Yeah, Chad, thanks for that, because this is, by the way, this is a topic a lot of people won't touch. And in fact, Donald Trump doesn't want to talk about it. Joe Biden refused to talk about it. Kevin McCarthy refused to talk about it. Nancy Pelosi refused to talk about it. And the reason they don't want to talk about it is because it becomes so hyper-politicized. You asked the question in a great way, because you asked the revenue side of the question. And this is something I think you guys, we've talked about on this podcast quite a bit. realizing that the biggest driver of our entire debt is the mandatory side of our ledger, which is now about 75 to 80% of our budget. So we have to get a handle on that. Of course, the biggest piece of the mandatory side is the Social Security outlays. And you're right that the trustees have said it's going to be insolvent, fairly soon. At that point, there's actually an automatic trigger that would cut the benefits to the level of the income, which would be by about 25%. And to Katrina's point, she's right that the problem is, maybe Chad, in your point, you're talking about your child. Well, your child, by the time they're working, is going to be paying a lot more in because you're going to need a lot more when you're dependent on it. So I agree. I've always said I'm very open to raising the income level, the income cap. And I think we could raise it a lot. But you realize if you raised it, like, say, 10% and you did it over 5 years, it's really the out years where you benefit the most. It's a small amount. Almost nobody would notice it. My right-wing friends get mad at me because that's a, quote, tax increase. But you could make a big difference in the out years by doing something small currently. On the other side, you asked, what else would you do? I would seriously look at the same time as you're raising the cap on the taxable income, you can raise the age before it kicks in. And I'm not talking about raising it like 10 years. I'm talking about like raising it 6 months, starting 1 month a year, starting 5 years from now. Again, recognizing we're living longer, we're more productive longer. And those two things, as small as they are at the moment for any one person or family, are huge in the out years and the outlays. But you first have to be willing to talk about it honestly, both from a revenue side and a benefits side, like we're doing right now. And there's just so many politicians afraid of the topic because they're afraid of the hammer that comes down on them, either from one side or the other. And that's why I think two solutions is the place. So we actually have had legislation to sort of do that. Mitt Romney had legislation called the Trust Act that I was on. I pretty much get on every piece of legislation that Republicans and Democrats together have offered up to at least have the discussion. And it's amazing how it doesn't go very far because leadership just doesn't want to talk about the topic.
Katrina, any response to that?
I think it's just really important to note that there are over 100,000 Social Security recipients currently in North Dakota. And if we're serious about supporting them, then we need to look at ways to fund it yesterday. And I think it's important that they know that we're working towards a solution that's actually going to be implemented rather than just kind of kicking the can down the road.
Senator, anything else, or Rob?
Well, no, I don't disagree with that. I mean, one of the things we have to do with current senior citizens, people currently on Social Security and those that are soon to be on Social Security is exempt them from anything we do. In other words, we don't need to start, we don't need to apply any of this to them. They're already entitled to, in my mind, based on what they've contributed to both the society and our economy as well as into the trust fund. This is why you have to think about it in the out years, or you're committing, really malpractice. So that's why the sooner we do it, the less dramatic the change will have to be. If you wait until it goes insolvent and then it's upon us, then the fix is going to be difficult for lots of people.
Let's talk about a related issue, which is the national debt. And we just passed $35 trillion, which I want to deploy the media cliche and call it a grim milestone, because that's really kind of what it is. It's, in my personal opinion, an existential problem facing this country. And it doesn't seem like a lot of people are talking about it. In fact, the Republican Party just passed a platform that, for the first time in my memory, didn't mention the national debt or budget deficits at all. We're now currently running annual budget deficits that are well over $1 trillion, and it's become a matter of routine. So, Senator, let's start with you. You've been in office for a while. What are we going to do about this? Are we ever going to get serious about it? Or is this going to be an issue like Social Security that nobody really wants to talk about?
Well, I think to answer that last question, people are talking about it. Part of the problem is that not very many people in the general public talk about it because they don't see a direct correlation to what they're going through. Although inflation, the Biden inflation really did sort of remind people what the eventual outcome is of over borrowing and overspending. flooding the market with free money, growing the demand without growing the supply side of the economy is what creates inflation. And so people are starting to see that, Rob. But one of the things that's happened in the United States for years, and Katrina alluded to the strongest economy in the world, our economy has covered our sins of borrowing for a long time. That's too bad on the one hand. On the other hand, we need to focus on the economy, because the first thing you do to reduce government spending is grow the economy to a point where you don't need so much government spending, and at the same time generate more revenue for the government to take care of its priorities. After that, I have always supported a balanced budget amendment. I personally believe, and I've been around my friends long enough to know, we will never fully balance our budget, in my view, unless it's required by the Constitution. And if it's required by the Constitution, you're more compelled to do the difficult things, have the difficult conversations, much like we were doing on Social Security just a little bit ago. So, and then if you just set aside the pandemic and the 35 trillion grim benchmark is grim indeed, but it's also somewhat artificial in the sense that it's, that all that one-time spending, which amounts to, 7, 8, billion or trillion dollars, which is exactly why when the Biden administration came in, the last thing they should have done, and not a single Republican supported them in doing it, was pass not one, but two multi-trillion-dollar bills and borrowed all the money to do it when the supply side of the economy was suffering already from an over flooded demand side. So we got to get our fiscal house in order, that's for sure. But we also have to have honest discussions with our constituents so that they know that this may require some sacrifice on the part of a lot of people.
Katrina, same question to you.
I guess I'd like to ask Senator Cramer what cuts he'd like to have to deal with the debt, and he talks about the current administration. The previous one also had the debt increase over $7 trillion. Since Senator Cramer's been in office, the debt has increased $10 trillion. Mm-hmm. We've had trade wars, we've had COVID, we've had to go through recovery. And the reality is a lot of career politicians don't really want to do the hard work of balancing the budget while also protecting Social Security and Medicare. As, Senator Cramer said, they'll come down on you with a hammer. And I think, one of the things that we see from career politicians is often them talking about, blame, right, when it comes to these problems in a long-term way. But the reality is our Congress only knows how to deal with problems in the short term. How many debt ceiling limits has Senator Cramer voted on? How many, midnight votes has he had to take to keep the government open? And, I think if we really had a strong sense of bipartisanship and the responsibility that we have to future Americans, we can balance the budget. In fact, I am old enough to remember a time when we did have a balanced budget. I was even old enough to receive a surplus during the first W. Bush administration. And so, I think the thing that we know is that there are really two solutions to this problem, and that's closing tax loops for the ultra wealthy and mega corporations and the top 2% of those wealthy people. And the other thing that we have to look at is promoting economic growth. And that means reshoring manufacturing jobs and investing in innovation so that we continue to grow our economy in the most awesome way possible, which is through new technologies. Truly, and we need to be manufacturing those technologies. That is our history, and that is our future.
Senator Cramer, I know you're going to want to respond to some of that.
Oh, yeah, she just argued with herself. On the one hand, she wants to raise taxes on corporate America, and on the other hand, she wants to reshore manufacturing. Those two things are in direct conflict, which is why the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it's going to expire. Most of those tax benefits are going to expire next year, that include things like, immediate expensing for manufacturers and farmers and others, R&D tax credits. Those things expire next year, and the rate that the Harris-Walz campaign just put out their tax policy. They want to raise corporate rates again. And one of the things that did reshore a lot of manufacturing in the United States after 2017 what were two things. One, lower corporate rates in the United States so that we're no longer the highest corporate rate country in the world, which is what we were before. Now we're roughly in the middle. You raise them back up, we go among the highest in the world. That allowed us to reshore more manufacturing. The other thing was the repatriation of money. We doubled tax income that's generated by American companies in other countries. So there's, as a matter of just good policy, they leave those revenues in the other country and they invest them in the other countries. We open the window for them to repatriate that money at no further tax harm. So all of that expires next year. And if we don't fix, and by the way, I'm not one that says we need to make the Trump tax cuts permanent. I think we need to make them better. I think we should make the tax code flatter. I think we still have 7 brackets. I think 5 would be better. 3 would be better still, but that's got, there's ramifications to all of that too, and how you do that. So, I agree. We need to grow the economy, but if you taxed every billionaire in America 100%, you wouldn't touch the national deficit and debt and deficit. So what we've got to do is have pro-growth policies, and tax increases are not pro-economic growth policies.
Katrina, I'll let you respond to that. And specifically, Senator Cramer brought up the Trump tax cut. So maybe tell us how.
Which expire, right? They expire, and the middle class is going to end up getting a 9% tax increase starting in 2026. And so I think it's really important that we actually have a representative that's interested in representing the middle class. And I would just like to point out that Senator Cramer in his answer did not mention anything he would like to cut. And so the reality is, we do have to look at that corporate tax structure. There is a lot of movement, I think, in terms of corporations being able to avoid taxes. And if you look at the Trump's tax cuts, I'm not sure how much reshoring it actually brought, but it certainly brought a lot of stock buybacks.
Senator Cramer, she said you didn't mention any spending cuts. I want to give you an opportunity if you want to mention some.
Sure. I mean, if we want to go line by line through the code, just remember only about 20% of the entire budget is discretionary. So we have to go after the mandatory spending side of the ledger. And we can do that. I'm willing to do that. That's why I supported the Trust Act. But that requires sitting down and being willing to have a discussion, bipartisan discussion, and then explain to your constituents why you cut the things that you cut. That's why I said that the first thing you have to do is you have to have a significant, serious family discussion about these things. Because if you just go in there with a hatchet or even a scalpel, without further explanation, this is why she talked about midnight votes. Since Chuck Schumer has become majority leader, that's exactly what we do. Midnight votes. It's similar, by the way, to the Langford bill relating to immigration. There were no hearings. We don't have hearings anymore. The Appropriations Committee now in the last 2 years has started finally having appropriations hearings. Chuck Schumer will not allow a vote on those appropriations. He waits till Christmas and has a comprehensive vote on a bill that he puts together. So the first thing we have to do in the new Congress is restore regular order in the appropriations process, because one of the things that will hold members of the Senate and Congress accountable is when you have transparent dialogue between the parties, between the various members, and then you have that honest discussion, not in an omnibus spending bill, but one appropriations bill at a time. That's the way it's designed. So we have to start with the process. And one thing's for sure, if Republicans become the majority, we will have a new majority leader, and that majority leader will be required by our conference to do exactly that.
So process does affect a lot of different things, and specifically constituents that you both are trying to serve. We don't have a farm bill currently. I want to ask a little bit about the next farm bill. The current safety net was established in 2014. Since then, input costs have gone up between 25 and 30%. Is it time for us to look at increases in the reference prices in order to create these safety nets for our farmers and ranchers? And are we going to get a farm bill? Yeah. Katrina, we'll start with you.
Oh, sure. Well, the price of corn this morning, I believe, is $3.70 per bushel. The price of wheat's $3.86, and the price of soybeans are $9.43. And every farmer woke up grumpy, right? Because like you said, Those input costs are way up. And right now, grain prices are way down. The reality is we've had a tremendously bad ag market since the 2018 Farm Bill. We talk about these people who are in Washington, D.C., and they're supposed to be getting things done. They have 5 years to renew the Farm Bill, and we don't have it yet. What we do have is high interest rates for farmers where their operating costs. They have low grain prices right now, and they have consolidation in the input markets that don't allow for competition. And so we've had 2 ag trade deficits in the United States of America since the 2019 trade war. That never happened in 60 years. We've had 2 trade deficits. Our farmers have lost competitive markets that they're not getting back from the Trump trade wars. And so we need to deal with that basis issue. And we need to deal with the fact that we have consolidation when it comes to the seed and chemical manufacturers and our equipment manufacturers, and the consolidation on the value-added processing side. We have 4 mega corporations that process all the grain in the United States. Or we have, consolidation in the rails that move the grains out of North Dakota, right? North Dakota is the 3rd largest ag producer in the United States of America. And we have a 6th of the value-added processing after California and Iowa. And there's just this disparity in North Dakota for our growers. They can't capture that revenue if we're just shipping everything out, and they have to pay high input costs, and they have to sell their grain low. And on top of that, when you look at the rancher piece, and I've been all across the state, I've been to 52 out of the 53 counties. I've been to a ranch on the east and the center and on the west now. And the reality is they're all suffering because we don't have country of origin labeling for our beef and pork. It's really important from a national security and a food security point of view that country of origin labeling be on our beef and pork, because our producers in North Dakota, and we produce 13 times the amount of beef that we consume, deserve to be getting 30 to 40% more for the beef that they make, because it's that damn good. And our congressional members have no excuse for not getting this done.
Senator?
Well, there's a lot there. To answer your first question, yes. Yes, it is time to raise the floor on input costs, or to raise the floor on the support in the safety net programs, reference prices, same with crop insurance. We need to raise the floor to reflect the inflation that's been caused by the current administration. And by the way, these trade deficits have happened rather recently. Having said that, one of the things that just this week that I've been very involved in the last really couple of weeks, I'm the only member of Congress that I know that talked to Justin Trudeau about intervening in the pending rail strike in Canada. I said, if you wait, Mr. Prime Minister, until the strike happens, which is their tradition up there, then you're going to have a disruption, which is going to hurt basis. And by the way, with Canadian Pacific, Kansas City merger, they now have a 3-country railroad in Canada. And that means their obligations to farmers are not just in Canada, even though that's what they were talking about yesterday. It's in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And I hope in the next trade deal we address that issue. I was grateful yesterday when Ambassador Hillman contacted me and let me know that the minister is now intervening and forcing arbitration. But in the United States, two years ago, I led the charge along with Cynthia Lummis, my colleague from Wyoming, to get not just Democrats, but Republicans on board with President Biden to intervene in a rail strike to make sure that our farmers weren't hurt by a stoppage of work. And of course, ultimately that turned out. We passed the bill. Joe Biden signed the bill, and we had the strongest union president ever, evidently. And, strong free market conservatives working together on that issue. You don't hear a lot about those things. That's one of my points. There's a lot more bipartisanship that goes on than what people might know about, because it's not very sexy to write about. But with regard to the Farm Bill specifically, yes, we need to raise the reference prices. But here's what the hangup is. And it's been now coming up on September 30th. That'll be the second time that we'll have to extend the existing Farm Bill, to your point, Chad, that was 7 years ago. And it's getting to the point now where it's harder to do that. A year ago, farmers would rather have a good farm bill than just any farm bill. Now it's getting a little bit more panicky, and frankly, the bankers have a lot to say about this. But the reason we're at an impasse is because, and I predicted this probably on this podcast, when the chairman, Debbie Stabenow from Michigan, who's retiring after this year, chairman of the Ag Committee, when they put a whole bunch of money for nutrition programs within the Farm Bill and conservation programs, calling it, the war against global warming, they created an imbalance, a further imbalance in the whole Farm Bill. We always worried about that. I said, if you change the benchmarks, you change those lines, the Farm Bill is going to become less about farming and more about the other side of the formula. And now it's gotten to a point where it's about 80-20. And that's what we're having a problem with. It's hard to raise those reference prices when they've moved a bigger chunk of the formula over to the other sides of the Farm Bill agenda. So we've got a lot of work. I don't think we'll get a Farm Bill. Well, we're certainly not going to get one by September 30th. So there'll be another extension. I do think we can get one by the end of the year, however. Republicans have passed one in the House. We have not had one come to the floor yet in the Senate. I don't even know that they've had a markup in the Senate because, of course, our rules are a little bit different. But we have to put the farmer back in the Farm Bill and not just rely on, Debbie Stabenow's, swan song as she leaves Congress to just raise everything except reference prices for the farmer.
Katrina, do you want to respond?
I have given Kevin Cramer a lot of credit as I've been traveling around the state the last 10 months. He's really good at identifying problems and assigning blame. And I think it's pretty obvious that that's where his job stops. I think that we can hold our representatives accountable to delivering everybody a good farm bill. Agriculture is North Dakota's second largest industry. And to hold off on fixing the basis, to hold off on correcting the high interest rates for operating loans leads to this. For every point that farmers and ranchers have on their interest rate for their operating loans leads to 6 points of lost future growth. So all this time that we spend arguing or not going forward with the good plans, even if we have to compromise, means that we lose out on future growth. Our farmers, our ranchers lose out on future earnings. That's the reality that we're living in right now. They're getting screwed, and career politicians are just kind of like, well, we can't figure it out.
Well, we figured it out. The Republican bill in the Senate, the John Bozeman bill, raises reference prices. It literally raises reference prices, just what we're talking about. And that's important to the banker. That's important to the farmer. It helps with the basis. It's Debbie Stabenow on the Democrats. It's not my fault. It's their fault. But that's where the fault lies. Is she doesn't want to raise reference prices. She wants to raise nutrition prices. She wants to get more money into conservation programs so she can deal with the existential threat of climate change. And so somehow farmers going to pass on profit so that we can avoid climate change. By the way, agriculture is the number one economic engine in North Dakota, and it's not the second, it's number one. And with regard to interest rates, this, again, I'm sorry, you're right. I'm good at laying the blame, but because I know where the blame belongs.
I know.
Listen to me. The interest rates are a result of inflation. Inflation is a result of democratic policies in the current Senate and the current president and the last House when it was under Democratic control. When they passed the IRA and they passed the American Rescue Plan, they supercharged inflation, and it went from when the Democrats came in from 1.4% inflation to about 9% inflation. Obviously, the result of that is higher interest rates, and they're stuck there now for quite a while. Maybe there'll be a slight cut here in September. But do I lay the blame where it belongs? You darn right I lay the blame where it belongs. And I don't know how having another Democrat in the Senate and giving Chuck Schumer more authority is ever going to bring down interest rates or inflation.
Katrina,
excuse me. Yeah. Actually, I would like to. I'm not the Democratic Party. I'm in North Dakota today, even though the DNC was going on. So please don't do that. And, I'm a regular North Dakotan. The reality is my life is impacted every day by inflation. And a lot of it has to do with the trade wars. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that there are winners and losers when it comes to inflation. The reality is, and I experience this when I go to the grocery store. So we know that those mega food corporations are, taking advantage of us on the margins. But, in November, this is a story I have to tell. My family and I were in a car crash. It was in South Dakota. It was on the way back from visiting my parents at Thanksgiving. And I was really lucky. My kids were okay. My husband was okay. And we were stuck in the ditch for 2 hours. And all I could think was, I sure hope really nobody hit their head, because my adrenaline was just running so high. And I didn't really have any time to think about, like, what am I going to do not having the second car that I saved 3 years. And it took me 3 years to convince my husband that we were good to go and buy this new car. And it took about 2 months to get the insurance payments. And farmers know insurance payments don't make you whole, right? And the reality is I was dealing with a $7,000 increase in a similar car purchase with only one key fob because of the chip crisis, and more than 3% increase in the interest on the loan that I had to take out to buy my second car, because I need to go to work and my kids need to go to school. And the reality is that the meat packers, the major food processing companies, and the banks are the winners when it comes to this inflationary environment. Senator Cramer, you've taken corporate PAC money from Goldman Sachs. I don't know if you're accountable to North Dakotans or the banks who really like higher interest rates.
Well, let Senator Cramer respond to that, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah. No, I take money from all kinds of interests that are in the value chain. The banks don't win on high inflation. I don't know where you get that idea. The North Dakota Bankers Association, Independent Community Bankers of North Dakota Association, the Credit Unions of Association of the Dakotas all support my campaign. No question about it. But so do all of the farm groups. So do the grain growers, so do the soybean growers, so do the corn growers. So yeah, do I take money from people that are in the value chain of agriculture, transportation? You bet. I'm co-chairman of the transportation subcommittee. It's why I've reached out to Canada and helped them, urge them along to settle their rail strike that's going to impact our farmers. But again, this is not just a one-person job, obviously. But what you're suggesting, you're trying to run as a Democrat, as an independent. Chuck Schumer will be the majority leader if Democrats have the majority in the next Congress. It doesn't matter how independent you are. When Chuck Schumer is a majority leader, he sets the agenda. He'll decide if we have a farm bill vote or not. It won't be you. It won't be me. It won't be anybody. It won't even be the Republican leader. It'll be him if he's the majority leader. So yeah, party doesn't matter. I get that we're more moderate Democrats in North Dakota than other places probably. But there's a consequence to every single one of these jobs.
Let's move beyond American borders for a moment. We have foreign policy, obviously a hugely important part of our national policy strategy. And really right now, there's probably two issues that are most on the minds of Americans in that realm, which is the war in Ukraine and the war between Israel and Palestine. Let's talk about Ukraine first. Senator Cramer, your party, Republicans, and this is hard to describe, and I want to make sure I'm doing it fairly, but there has been a transition away from maybe a more Reagan-esque or George W. Bush era Republican view on foreign policy towards maybe an older sort. I don't know how to describe it, but there is a faction within your party that is very much opposed to supporting Ukraine. You are not part of that faction. In fact, you are out of favor with them, at least on that issue. Right. Describe a little bit. I mean, what should America's commitment to Ukraine be going forward? In the coming years, and hopefully, I mean, none of us want that war to continue for years. But,
right.
I mean, assuming what should our commitment be there?
Yeah, it's a great point, because North Dakotans and Americans in general are rightly concerned about what we're doing in other countries, because of course they're facing so many struggles locally, internally. When you have a wide open border, how can you support another country's border? I get that. All I know is that the price of a war is a lot higher than the price of facilitating freedom. And what's happened is, ever since the pathetic, tragic, bungled withdrawal from Afghanistan by Joe Biden, who was just wanted so badly to be relevant, every dictator and despot in the world, including Xi Jinping in China, has looked at us and seen this projection of weakness, and they decided to invade. And so with Ukraine, I went to Ukraine about 3 weeks before the war broke out, because we had intelligence that was, more certain than theirs was, obviously. And I spent a lot of time with their leadership, and what they were asking for, we didn't deliver. We passed legislation, and then the Biden administration sat on weapons systems for a very long time, still do, by the way, put all kinds of conditions on it, all the while these brave freedom lovers are fighting for their own country against Vladimir Putin, who, if he's left unchecked and allowed to continue to take Ukraine, that's just the beginning. It's well into NATO countries next, Romania, Poland, and several others. So I think what we have to do is we have to support them as much as we can with intelligence, with weapons systems. One of the things about supporting Ukraine with weapons, it's actually helped loosen up our own industrial complex to build new weapon systems and provide some more long-term certainty in terms of modernizing our own military. I spent the last couple of days in Grand Forks looking at legacy systems and very, very, very modern systems, including a lot of space assets, which of course were the result of my leading the legislation to create a Space Force. I think the most important thing we can do, Rob, is be strong and project that strength. There's no, Ukraine was never invaded under Donald Trump. He was under Obama and Biden, and then not under Trump. Nor was Xi Jinping building islands. Nor was North Korea testing nuclear weapons. And certainly the terrorists in Iran couldn't fund any Hamas or Hezbollah or Houthis or anybody else, because they didn't have the money to do it, because we cut them off. So we need to make a commitment. But at the same time, remember, Donald put NATO on notice. NATO countries on notice, said, if you aren't paying your fair share, there's going to be something. There's going to be punishment for that, or some sort of a withholding. And he got a lot of countries to finally get on board with the NATO level of that floor of 2% funding for national defense. So it's all the above. But I also would add this, and this is where I do part company even more so than the Ukraine issue, Rob. And again, I understand the position, but I do part company with, we just can't retreat from every place in the world and think that we're saving money. If every time we retreat from a mission in Africa, in an African country, or somewhere in Asia, or even Latin America, we leave a vacancy for China to step in and use financing, predatory financing, to get to lock in on military bases of all types. It's a long, obviously, discussion, but I'm not. While I understand populism and I adhere to some of it, I do not adhere to isolationism. Never have. I can't imagine that I will.
Katrina, same question to you.
I believe that this is actually an issue where Senator Cramer and I agree, supporting Ukraine and stopping a dictator that kills his rivals is putting America first. The cost of war, as Senator Cramer said, is much, much higher than the cost of supporting our Ukrainian allies. We can't leave them to languish. It empowers China, and that empowers Iran, and that empowers North Korea. And the reality is our investment in Ukraine keeps Americans free from having to go to war. It keeps our economy strong. And our future should be really focused on growth and innovation and freedom. And so I'm not going to assign blame. I'm pretty sure that Putin's to blame. He invaded Crimea. And, at this point, it doesn't matter. We need to help out Ukraine and make sure that Putin does not spread his vision for domination into our allied countries. And we certainly don't want to see people go to war. My son is 16, and I often see now when I'm signing him up for things, that thing about, when you're 18, you need to sign up for the draft. And we don't want world war. We want peace, we want growth, we want innovation, and we want freedom. Those are the things we need to be focused on, and making good bipartisan decisions supporting our allies is important.
Katrina, the other part of this is Israel, Palestine. What do you think of what America has done to this point? What should we be doing? What is our commitment there going forward?
I think it's easier to say the answer than to achieve it. I think that's the case with Israel and in general. I was an adult, when 9/11 happened, and I remember the terror that I felt on 9/11. And Israel, of course, has a right to defend itself from terrorism. But we need to move beyond that. We really need to get a solution to bring those hostages home. I think we've seen in the news the suffering that those families have faced, and they are in support of a ceasefire. So the second objective is to get a ceasefire. It's really important that we do that, but we can't stop there. We really do need a two-state solution. The United States has tried and tried to achieve a two-state solution. I remember Yasser Arafat. I thought we were going to be close then. And I really do feel like we need to continue after we bring those hostages home. After we get the ceasefire, we need to be serious about, okay, how do we resolve this so this doesn't happen again in 5 years and 10 years and 15 years? That's the sort of leadership that we need to stay focused on the objectives. But I want to be very real about the fact that it's much easier to say that answer than to implement it.
Senator Cramer, same question to you.
Well, no, I think she's right. I would just say, what diplomacy, statecraft is tough, right? There's carrots, there's sticks, there's friends of your enemies and enemies of your friends, and we like to oversimplify things in geopolitics, and that's generally what you see a lot of politicians doing, and it's always more complex than that. But I will say this: that just as our country, you see this sort of paralysis in politics, if you will, although I will say, turn off the TV cameras and you see a lot less of it, or at least focus the cameras on the things that are happening. But the same thing's happening around the world, and free countries versus dictatorships and versus, terrorism countries, terrorism governed countries. It's really, really separating the friends from the enemies. I always say there are three types of people in statecraft. There are friends, there are enemies, and then there are frenemies. And the complexity of the Middle East is that you have frenemies. And the question is, do they become more friends than they do enemies? Are we able to give them enough room to be successful? The Abraham Accords are probably the most significant geopolitical gain in the last, 30, 40 years for this country and for the Middle East. And the Biden administration has been trying to sort of add to that. The problem is you have to identify your enemies and make sure they understand there will be a consequence if you cross these lines. And that way, your frenemies, they're confident in your position and in the longevity of your projection of strength. And you are a reliable friend, not just every 4 years we'll see who's in the White House sort of situation, because there are a lot of Arab nations that want to be more like us than like Iran. But we cannot allow Iran to continue to do what they do. You realize their foreign reserves have gone from about $4 billion to $250 billion since the sanctions were lifted, particularly for oil. We got to look out for America first, but not America only. But we also have to know who our enemies are and make sure they understand that we know who they are.
So I want to get one last question in here. We're sort of up against it. One of the things that Rob and I have been talking about quite a bit over the last several months is just this sort of shift in the two parties in terms of the government being engaged in our everyday lives. I think about, and we saw it a lot in Chicago, I think about, in terms of abortion rights and healthcare, in terms of, J.D. Vance saying folks that don't have families in the same way he does or lesser than or something like that. Do you think it's fair to say Democrats and many of their perspectives are now the small government, in the words of Tim Walz, stay out of my mind your own damn business? Katrina, we'll start with you, and then Senator Cramer would love to hear your response.
I do think that the Democratic Party has had to shift to being a bigger tent and having more centrist policies. And when it comes down to doing things for America, in support of America, I'm running because I love America. That makes sense. And I have a number of family members that don't have children, and I love them just the same, and they have value just the same. And so I can't imagine what that would feel like. I can't imagine for somebody who's struggling to have a family, what hearing that must be like. it's already really frustrating to try to conceive if you're struggling. And so what I see is a lack of compassion sometimes, but I think that lack of compassion has come from this breach in our ability to govern with bipartisanship at the core, right? And then we kind of had these teams, and then we have caucuses, and it just becomes so divisive. You actually forget that you agree with this person over here about 80% of the time, right? And that's one of the things that I found, going around the state, talking to independents, talking to Republicans, is we sure agree on a lot. And we shouldn't be fighting over whose side we're on. We're on Team America. We're on Team North Dakota at the end of the day. And these labels, while they are useful for running political campaigns, I'm not sure they're so useful when it comes to getting things done at the end of the day.
Senator Cramer?
Yeah, I mean, we have this wonderful system in the United States called self-governance. And what Katrina is experiencing, and I've done what she's doing. I've run against incumbents most of the time, actually, and certainly several times before I actually won a race. And now I've been the incumbent in a few races. And when you are out visiting with people and you get that sense of frustration, it's. I would just say this. For one thing, it's a sense. It's part of what's so special about North Dakota. I mean, look what we're doing right now, right? I mean, it's what's great about North Dakota. We are basically North Dakotans first. I always remind my Republican friends in North Dakota, we're not entitled to these jobs. I was a Republican Party chairman when we didn't have a single member of Congress. We didn't have a governor. We'd only had one in 38 years. And suddenly, we started winning, and now the only people we fight with are ourselves. That's the problem when the tent gets as big as our tent has gotten. The only people we get to fight against are ourselves. And so I think North Dakotans in particular, I think Midwesterners more generally, who are common sense and understand the 80-20 rule, get more frustrated by it. This is why I wish more people could see what we actually do together. Amy Klobuchar and I, Minnesota and North Dakota, Democrat, Republican, we went to Ukraine together. We are the co-chairs of the Foster Care Adoption Caucus in the United States Senate, which is a bicameral caucus. And Angus King and I are the co-chairs, the founding co-chairs, actually, of the America-Canada Economic and Security Caucus. These are all, I don't go into a single caucus as a chairman, and I've been chairman of a number of them without getting a Democrat co-chair. Because you're right, we get more common sense, we understand there are more things we agree on. I do think the Senate is special in this way, and this is why Katrina wanting to become a member of the Senate, me being a member of the Senate, it's special in this way in that you do have, even in a state with only one congressman, you do have a different obligation to push against the impulses of the fringes, if you will, and the impulses of the many. Because of the 6-year terms, because there's only 100 of you, all those things that the founders knew. But that's also under some attack right now. And we have to defend this, what's so special about the Senate, or we'll never be able to have these kinds of conversations across political aisles.
Well, we asked the candidates for an hour, and we've taken an hour and a minute. So I really appreciate it. And really, we kind of landed on a really good
I want all the time.
We really landed on a pretty good place to stop. So we're going to stop there. I want to thank you both for participating. I think this was a really good conversation, and look forward to watching the rest of the election cycle play out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great weekend. Take care.